Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next TED Talk. I'm Srinivas Chokakula. I'm the President and Chief Executive at CPR. And I'm also the one who leads this TEDS initiative that hosts the TED Talk series. For those people who are new, I would guess that there would be many. TEDS initiative is Transboundary Rivers, Ecologies and Development Studies. This was founded when the Ministry of Jal Shakti established a research chair at Center for Policy Research to pursue research interests in transboundary river water governance generally. But we expanded our interests to water policy and governance issues, and TED Talks are we usually host these TED Talks on engaging with these contemporary policy issues on water. The last talk happened on intermittent water supply, so there is a broad spectrum of issues that we engage with in this TED Talk series. This particular one, we also pick up certain themes depending on the ongoing research program. We have an MOU with the National Mission for Clean Ganga to pursue research interests in to inform policy and policy thinking and institutional transformation towards rejuvenating India's rivers. So under this program, we have a few research projects, and one of the projects engages with this particular issue of water-centric urban planning. The idea is to critically engage with this fundamental instrument of planning in the cities, which is statutory master plan. And then whether there is a way of reimagining it to address these concerns, emerging environmental concerns, including water. So one of that we have, this is not radically new, when you say that we need to look at the master plan in cities to address these environmental concerns. This has been something that has been mentioned by many institutions which are involved in it. Ministry of Urban Housing and Urban Affairs, and then the town planners. If you see, there has been many calls to look at and reimagine master plan instrument, the statutory master plan instrument. But what we find is that there is very little body of work that takes it beyond saying that we need to relook at it. And I mean, particularly, we don't see much of research, but then we certainly see quite a few interesting, practitioners' perspectives that come in through work that happens on master plans. But when we look at the body of work that has, that is there, the limited body of work, what we find is that we find Matthew's work, today's speaker's work, is something that echoes similar sentiments and then makes an effort to take it forward in looking at how we can really reimagine this statutory instrument of master plan for accommodating these environmental concerns. And also while acknowledging the limits and then also potentials for using master plan to address these issues. So it is in this context that we requested Matthew to come and share his thoughts about it. And he was kind enough to allow us to reschedule while we were trying to sort of organize this talk. You must have seen that rescheduling notices as well. But finally, we could make it happen. And just quickly about Matthew, and as I said, is someone who has been dealing with these issues, urban planning and governance issues. Though he's a lawyer, he's been dealing with these issues for the past 12 years. Let me just quickly read his bio. Matthew is an independent legal and policy consultant in Bangalore and a visiting faculty at National Law School of India University. He has engaged with this field of urban governance and policy for over 12 years through academic research, teaching, consultancy, policy engagement, advocacy, and writing. Matthew has taught urban governance and law at Azim Premji University and as well as National Law School Institute of University Institute and National Law School of India University, and contributed to research on peri-urban governance, planning law, sanitation, low carbon urban design, and urban employment. He has also helped draft the Greater Bangalore Governance Bill 2018 and writes regularly on various law and policy issues. I mean, if you look at the kind of writings that Matthew has produced, I mean, you could clearly see that distinct approach, trying to understand the urban planning practices and ecosystem, generally, the larger governance ecosystem, and then ask these very important questions around these. So with that, just quickly before handing over to Matthew to give his talk, just a couple of housekeeping rules, but just please put your questions in the Q&A space, and then please be short and precise, because the lengthier the difficulty it is to manage on the online platform. But if you do have very serious questions that you want to ask, you can certainly write to Matthew. I'm sure he would appreciate that. So please make sure that you put your questions, but otherwise I think chat is available to exchange notes. But Q&A, please restrict it to your questions, short and precise. Thank you. I think the plan is that we would give Matthew about 45 minutes for his talk, and then open it for and then address the questions that are there in the Q&A. With that, Matthew, over to you.
Thanks, Srinivas. It's great to be here, and thanks for the generous introduction. It's great to be here at CPR online. I mean, it's as I was just mentioning, it was exactly 1 year since I spoke here in a CPR CSH sort of forum, looking at urban planning law and its engagement with informal livelihoods and informality in general. So this time I'm sort of taking it in a different direction, sort of looking at urban planning, its links with water governance, and how the law sort of holds all of these things together. So it's an honor to speak in this TED Talk series. I've actually followed it a bit. I think attended a couple of them. So it's an honor to be here. And if you look at the profile of the three speakers before me who came in this platform, all of them were extremely and much more experienced than me, and have practitioners with loads of years of experience. So it's an honor to be part of this. And just at the outset, let me clarify: I'm not an urban planner. I suspect that high number of people in the audience would be urban planners. So I'm coming into this field sort of from the outside. Also, I'm not a water expert or a water governance person. As Srinivas sort of alluded to, I'm a lawyer by training, and I've been working on issues around urban law, governance, and policy for 10, 12 years. And through both practice and some academic engagement, I've had chances to engage with questions around urban planning law and urban governance law broadly. So that's just want to give context of where I'm coming from, and how that might sort of influence the lens of analysis that I use here. It's not either a extremely technical planning lens of looking at stuff, nor is it a hydrology or water or any of those sort of questions. We are looking at institutions, processes, laws, how they engage with each other, and questions regarding that. Okay, so with that, let me maybe share my screen. Okay, this is visible, I hope. Yes. Okay.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Thanks. So as I said, I'm looking at urban planning, water governance, and the law. Looking at what are possible legal frameworks for what is possibly a water-sensitive and climate-resilient city. I mean, to develop a water-sensitive and climate-resilient urban framework in India. That's what we're looking at. What is the current status, in this area, and how can things be, right? So I'll speak about 45 minutes. So I'm keeping track of time. So there are 3 parts to my talk. I'll get to that. But initially, just as an aside, just to start with the situation we're dealing with. So as I guess all of you know, or pretty much all of you know, India is sort of in Indian cities are often, more often than not, facing all types of water crisis, right? And we have been marked as water stressed or water scarce or extremely high risk by various indicators, right? And the nature of this water crisis actually, sort of shifts from extreme water scarcity on one level to instances of urban flooding on the other, right? So, for example, if you see just a few months back here, I'm based in Bangalore. If you remember reading the news, Bangalore was facing a major water scarcity sort of crisis. So taps were running dry in many parts of the city, and uh, water tankers were not delivering. Bowels had gone dry. So as the deputy chief minister and the Bangalore development minister of the state sort of indicates, the bowel in his house also sort of went dry. So and this obviously attracted a lot of attention, and there were sort of quick fix solutions. We'll get to that. This is again another example that I'm trying to indicate. On the other hand, you have urban flooding that we see. This is just about a couple of months back in Delhi. You saw, urban flooding causing the death of three, IAS aspirants who sadly drowned in the basement of a coaching center, and this led to a lot of protests, right? So these are, of course, just two anecdotes of the kinds of crises that we are facing. Just wanted to highlight what is the kind of approach that the state takes in responding to this, right? So at one level, if you look at what happened in the case of Delhi, you see that after this coaching center sort of crisis, you had the Municipal Corporation of Delhi actually realizing that firstly that basement was operating illegally, and they've went and targeted all other basements of coaching centers which were targeted, operating illegally. And they, of course, the image here says 13, but they went on to seal more than 30 basements of various coaching centers whose basements were supposed to be for parking. It's been converted for converted as libraries and workspaces, as an extension of the built area of the coaching center, right? So that was the kind of response we saw there. Here you see very interesting, a very different kind of response in Bangalore. It was again water crisis, and then when the crisis happens, that's when we realize the kinds of things that are actually operating. The government suddenly realized that out of the 3,500 water tankers that were operating in the in the city, only 219 water tankers were registered. The others were quote unquote operating illegally, right? So what did the government do? They actually went ahead and started impounding water tankers themselves. The transport department, interestingly enough, went and started impounding these tankers, and then decided, okay, we are going to deliver water in this part. We are not going to deliver water in certain other parts. That actually, resulted in a set of other crises, because the water tankers which were delivering water to certain neighborhoods, because it was taken over by the state, it was no longer delivering it there, and it was delivering it elsewhere, right? So this is, of course, the kind of response we see. So, I mean, I'm not going to in this talk try to give answers regarding how this can be solved. That's not the idea. It's just a sense of the knee-jerk type response we seem to have, when it comes to questions around urban, questions around governance, and questions around any kind of crisis, right? The idea of crisis, the water crisis. How do you respond, right? So what is so let me now, that was just an intro. Let me just get on to what this talk is about, right? So in the context of these multiple water crises that Indian cities face, my talk seeks to look at the legal framework of urban planning and urban governance, and how that engages with questions around water governance. It actually examines the lack of synergy that is there in the legal frameworks governing, planning, water, environment, and local governance. It specifically focuses on the device of the master plan, which is a key legal instrument that governs the city. It examines how the legislative framework of the master plan continues to be quite narrow and inadequate to address crucial areas like environmental protection, climate change, and water management. Having identified this, the talk sort of looks at what are possible legal and policy frameworks that can integrate water sensitivity and climate resilience into urban planning and governance frameworks in India. Let me just state that it is exploratory at this stage. I don't have any sort of clear-cut solutions out there. These are exploratory questions that I'm examining. Also, just I'm actually in the process of writing a paper on this. So that's the context in which we are looking at this question here. Okay, so how is this structured? Very quickly, just 3 parts to this talk, and I want to divide it almost equally, about 15 minutes each, but I think I've already taken about 5 minutes, so I'll have to figure that out. So basically 3 broad sections. First, I look at the legal framework of the master plan. What is a master plan in the legal imagination, and also how does this actually operate? Secondly, I look at urban water governance systems and the laws that actually govern it. And thirdly, I look at what are, the last part of the presentation I indicated, what are alternative frameworks that we can possibly look at while looking at questions around urban planning and water governance, right? So that's the structure of the talk. So let's proceed. Okay, so this is, the status of master planning in India. I don't want to get into details here. I think many of you are aware. We often say that master planning in India, suffers from all kinds of crises in terms of implementation crisis, in terms of, how enforcement is, sort of not there, or sometimes, of course, the critical scholars speak about how informality is built into the plan and questions around that, right? But even before that, if you look at it, we might need to understand that out of the 4,000 statutory towns that we have, only 1,500 actually have, approved master plans at this stage. Out of the 35 capital cities that we have, only 20 of them actually have approved master plans. Census towns obviously will have very lower number of master plans, but that's sort of understandable because they are not, governed by urban local government. But interestingly enough, major statutory towns as well as major cities, including 15 out of the 35 capital cities in India, don't have an active master plan, at this stage. So even before we get into the question of the problems of how plans are framed and implemented, the very existence of a plan is often a problem, right? So this is often raised issues. For example, this is the context of Delhi. Supreme Court actually pulls up the Delhi Development Authority and says, "Where is the plan?" And it indulges in what people have called the jurisprudence of exasperation, right? The court just expresses extreme anger and irritation with the state of affairs. In fact, this is a term that Pradhabhanu Mehta has often used in his writing, and also from a global context, there are some South African legal scholars who've actually used this term. Anyway, so I don't want to get into the history of this term, but the point I'm trying to indicate is that if you read this is an observation of this is not an observation, this is an actual order of the court, right? Not an observation of court, just understand the relevance of it. It's an actual order which says an utter mess has been made in the city. Public authorities are not willing to remove the mess. The whole problem in the city is that public authorities are keeping everything in limbo to give themselves unreasonable powers. You don't provide the master plan while you continue to harass citizens. This was made in the context. This order was made in the context of a case which was dealt with sealing, and the lack of sealing. I don't want to get into the details of this case. So what we have is, when the master plan was not enforced, including at this point of time, between the time when a master plan expired and a new master plan came in, you have all kinds of other arrangements that are there, all kinds of regulations which give blanket sort of protections, right? So that's the context in which this observation was made. I'm just indicating this jurisprudence of exasperation as a sense of how various state institutions, and I'm counting the judiciary in it, as how they respond to all kinds of crisis situations. This jurisprudence of exasperation is something you see, quite often. I mean, and even now recently when when we came to that urban flooding case in Delhi and how the court responded, if you read the observations of the court, you would see a similar approach, right? Okay, so now let's get on to, as I said, the planning law framework in India and how sort of that is structured. I don't want to get into the details of it because in some ways I had done some of the details in another talk, as well as when I listened to a couple of the previous talks in the series, I remember the master plan has been unpacked in a very good way in by a couple of previous speakers in this series. So I won't be unpacking all the elements of master plans and all of that. Just trying to give a sense of the legal history here. I think it's important that we understand where we are and how we have arrived at where we are. So interestingly enough, the origins of town and country planning law in India is, not surprisingly based on the UK experience. I mean, on UK's Housing and Town Planning Act of 1909. This was used in the Bombay Planning Act of 1915, which is understandable very much. But what is even more interesting is possibly that what we have as the present town and country planning law system that we have, town and country planning acts, as so most of you in the audience would know, are laws which are the planning laws which are made at the state level, because urban and planning, all of that comes under the state list. The union makes a model law, and states, so union made a model law in 1960, and states have made various types of town and country planning acts. Now, so what is interesting, regarding our Town and Country Planning Act is that the Town and Country Planning Act of most states, I wouldn't say all states, the Town and Country Planning Acts of most states are largely, based on this model Town and Country Planning Law of 1960, which sort of takes influence from the Bombay Town Planning Act of 1954. Now, this Bombay Town Planning Act of 1954 itself is very much inspired by the Town and Country Planning Act of UK of 1947. So what is interesting is that this is not a colonial imposition that we have. We have sort of, willingly copied the UK system right at the moment of independence. Meaning 1947, we actually sort of take a law from 1947 UK and then adopt it in 1954, and then we take it further in 1960. I mean, there are changes in this. I don't want to get into the details here because it's not just a direct copy paste. Because if you look at, I'm not getting into the whole planning history. If you look at the previous planning laws that were there in UK, many of them had the idea of a comprehensive development plan systems didn't exist. It really came in only 1947. The town planning schemes idea used to exist earlier. But if you look at our town and country planning law, we've adopted the idea of a master plan or a comprehensive development plan with this new regime. But that doesn't mean that the town planning schemes and the sort of local planning ideas disappeared. Meaning, if you look at most planning laws, they have town planning schemes under them. It has not been used much, whether local planning, devices as well as town planning schemes has not been used much. As many of you are aware, Gujarat has been using it quite a bit, but Maharashtra to some extent, but generally we have not used it much. Instead, our focus has been on the device of the master plan or the development plan since this legislation has come into being. And I don't want to get into details here. This is an instance of what the Town and Country Planning Act seeks to do. It provides for planned growth of land use being a core element of it. It also speaks about execution of town planning schemes, right? And I'm quoting from the Karnataka law, but the Karnataka law is very similar to many other laws that we have. So I'm just using this as an example, right? So, and of course there is it is a 1961 law based on the 1960 model law. And it hasn't substantially changed. This is something that we need to know. I mean, there have been amendments, but the overall framework largely remains the same regarding how our laws look at the idea of planning. So if you look at the objectives, you see that one is this idea of regulating planned growth. Then of course there's this idea of stopping uncontrolled development of land speculation. There's the idea of directing future growth to other parts of the state. There are also aspects of environmental health and hygiene mentioned, but yeah, that's as much as we see. So if you look at the framework here, you'd see that it is largely centered around questions of let us go forward and we'll get a sense, right? So what is the planning framework that our TCP law seeks to create? One is it creates and I would say this is quite TCP laws of most states. I mean, I know there are exceptions, but TCP laws of many states have a similar pattern. You will generally have a director of town planning, a state town planning board, which is created. The most important sort of part of it is a declaration of a local planning area. An area will be declared as a local planning area. For a local planning area, you'll have a planning authority or a local planning authority. And then the local planning authority has to make land use plan initially for existing land use. And then when they make a master plan, they make proposed land use. So, but if you look at the structure of all of it, and there is also provision for town planning schemes in many of these laws, the focus has often been on this device of using the master plan or the development plan. You can use it interchangeably because the terms vary state to state, but it more or less does the same thing. That's been the focus of planning, right? Okay, this is a provision I think we should just look at a bit carefully, and I think it's important. Is if you look at planning law, and I've used here the Karnataka planning law as an example. This is obviously the state I'm most familiar with. That this is what defines what should be there in a master plan, right? So if you look at the definition of a master plan, it says that master plan is a series of maps and documents indicating how development and improvement can be carried out for a planning area, that is mentioned. So what should be there in a master plan? Zoning for land use for residential, commercial, industrial purposes, present land use maps and proposed land use maps, complete street pattern of all the roads that are there, areas reserved for parks, playgrounds, open spaces, land reserved for government planning authorities and other utilities, and declaring certain areas, for special, control, with sort of parallel, regulations for it, right? So what is striking here, and we can go into the document that has to come along with the master plan. Along with the master plan, there should be surveys that are published, which were carried out while the plan was being made. A report, explaining the provisions of the master plan. Most importantly, regulations in respect of each land use, and a report on how, the various stages in which the plan can be implemented. So if you go through both these provisions, what we see very clearly is that the imagination of the law, imagination of the planning legislation, is that the master plan is fundamentally land use zoning, device. It is a device that determines what can be done where and what can be built where to what extent, right? I mean, that's pretty much it, right? How can you use land for what purposes? If you use it for particular purposes, how should it be used? To what extent can you use? This is say setback and all of that. And the FAR norms, how much can you build, right? So development control regulations, land use, and use of land, and then as connected with that, you see land being reserved for certain public purposes, land being reserved for certain government purposes. That's the large sort of imagination that is there in the planning law, right? But we obviously see that the way we're thinking about planning has moved beyond that, right? So you see that increasingly newer plans have started to go beyond this framework, right? So, I mean, I'm just using one example here. There are multiple examples you can use. This is the draft master plan of Delhi 2041. It has two documents. One is volume 1, which is the vision document, and volume 2, which is the spatial development strategy. What I've indicated as the image on the left are the chapters of volume 1. So just look at the chapters that are there. It speaks about environment, economy, heritage, culture, public spaces, shelter, social infrastructure, transport, mobility, physical infrastructure. So it has, I mean, it's quite extensive. It is quite comprehensive. It speaks about various aspects of urban development, right? And if you look at the master plan framework that is there, the Delhi planning framework is slightly different. There's a slightly different legislative history. So I don't want to get into the details there because then it's not a ideal case for me to explain because of a slightly distinct regime. So I'm not going to get into there. But what we notice here is that the planning frameworks are now extending beyond what legally they're supposed to do, right? Legally, it's a very limited document, as I said, with heavy focus on land use, zoning, development control regulations, right? Here you see a much wider document. It's only in volume 2 where development control regulations are now called development control norms have been brought in. And there's a plan monitoring and an evaluation framework also in that document. Of course, this has not been this draft plan has not been formalized yet, but and this is an example. You'll see similar sort of planning instruments. You see, if you look at the Mumbai's development plan for 2034 or the revised master plan for Bangalore for 2031, which has actually not been published and it's been put aside. But either way, if you look at many of these new planning documents, you see that there is a wider sort of acceptance of other sectors into the planning framework, right? So if you look at from the context of water and climate resilience, for example, the Delhi plan provides specific chapters for addressing pollution and climate change. There's a chapter on enhancing blue-green infrastructure. There's a chapter on making Delhi water secure for water, wastewater, and drainage. So you see that there is an expanding scope of the master plan, but the legal scope remains limited. And I think it's important for us to understand the legal scope because unlike other planning devices, right? You can have other planning devices. The master plan is a statutory enforceable plan, which if it's violated, people can, you can go and try to enforce this, or the state itself can enforce this. So it's important to understand that master plan is a legally enforceable planning sort of instrument. But the legally enforceable planning instrument is part of what is there in the master plan as per law, right? So what is that? For that, it is about what land can be used for what purposes, reserving land for public purpose, and regulations of land use and buildings. All the sectoral components that we see in the master plan, are arguably beyond the legal mandate of the master plan and are arguably not enforceable, right? Meaning, you don't, at least maybe in a judicial forum, I have not come across any cases where it's really someone has tried to make it enforceable. So it often remains, outside the realm of direct enforceability. And I think it's important to understand this because, I'm talking about private conversations I've had with people, right? They call, the development control regulations and the land use zoning maps as the master plan, and everything else as, in a derisive way, literature. It's literature because it just reads nice. It's nice to read it and you derive some pleasure out of reading it, but it has no real, force or no real, direct significance on the ground. This is the kind of sort of thing that we need to think beyond. Okay, so we'll stop there on the first part. Quickly moving on to water governance. So I think maybe I'm about 3-4 minutes behind my own internal schedule, but it's fine. So that was my first part on the legal framework of master plan. Now I'm going to get into water governance, and then we'll bring all of these things together. So water governance, water, as many of you might know, is a state subject broadly under list 70, under entry 17 of the state list. But the union also has an important role to play under entry 56, which is about which deals with the regulation of interstate rivers. But even beyond that, I think as Srinivas's own work actually indicates, the union actually can play a much wider role and has often tried to play a much wider role in some of these questions. So under the entry 56, something called the River Boards Act was actually made, but it has remained a dead letter. It does not really come into real sort of force, or not much riverboats have been created under it. We're just looking at the national framework for water governance, right? We have something called the Central Water Commission that is there. Interestingly enough, the Central Water Commission was set up on the advice of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was a member of the Viceroy's Executive Council during the British government. If you remember, during that time, Congress used to boycott many of these forums, but Ambedkar was a member of it. And that's when it was not the Central Water Commission at the time; it was the Central Waterways, Irrigation and Navigation Commission, and later it was divided into various commissions. So that's a history of this body, and it still plays an important role, in water. And of course, then you have the Central Groundwater Board, which sort of is also a regulatory agency, and then you have a National Water Resources Council, which has mostly been a defunct agency, and it came up with the National Water Policy in 1987, and which has been revised a couple of times, but it's not. None of these agencies have really taken the idea of water governance at a national level in a sort of comprehensive way. Interestingly enough, now we're looking at the interaction between water governance and environmental law, right? Now, environmental law in India actually had a big moment in the 70s and 80s. During, interestingly, Indira Gandhi's period, where after we signed on to the Stockholm conference in 1972, we came and the Prime Minister actually requested various states to pass resolutions in their assembly to allow the union to legislate on the subject matter, on environment-related subject matter. So on wildlife protection and on water pollution, two legislations were passed in 1972, because the states allowed the union to legislate. Now, this was sort of post facto constitutionalized, in the 42nd constitutional amendment as one of the sort of controversial, constitutional amendments as carried out during the emergency, when many of the environmental subjects were shifted to the concurrent list, and then you had the the Air Act and all of that passed after that, and also the Environment Protection Act that was passed after that, right? So there is a interesting sort of regulatory regime around environmental law. It has some connections with water governance. The Water Act per se has established the pollution control boards, both at the national level and at various state levels. But what we see there is that these bodies actually have very sort of limited, sort of efficacy. Enforcement remains weak, and these pollution boards can impose fines, but those fines are so paltry that it doesn't really matter, right? And the scope, though it's called Water Act, it is essentially about controlling pollution at the source of pollution when it's released into the water. It doesn't provide any sort of comprehensive framework of providing for water in a sort of integrated way or anything like that, right? So that's the legislative scope of it. And then looking at how in this sort, that's the national context. Now let's get onto the urban context. In the urban context, we know, as many of you know, we had something called the 74th Constitutional Amendment. Under the 74th Constitutional Amendment, municipalities were created to function as institutions of self-government. And among the various functions that the municipality was supposed to perform under the 12th schedule, you have two functions that is, out of 18 functions that are directly relevant is water supply and sanitation. And so in that way, even otherwise, even before this amendment, municipalities generally had control over water, right? Water supply at least. But what we see is that we also have instances where other kinds of parallel institutions have been set up for water, right? So, for example, Bangalore has a parastatal agency called the Bangalore Water Supply and Sewerage Board, which is in charge of, say, water supply. Some states have what are called state water authorities, or for example, Kerala is a Kerala Water Authority, which does it. In many states, the Public Works Department carries out, water supply, right? Then there is also split between water supply, and water, how water is collected and water is distributed. There are, sometimes for distribution you use the local government. But anyway, so there's been a lot of concern around how water is governed. But I think one of the interesting things we should note here is that the policy imagination, the legal imagination around water has been mostly around water supply for drinking purposes, right? That's largely the imagination that our policy. I mean, it's changing. I'll accept that it's changing, but the policy imagination has largely been about supplying potable drinking water and making sure. And these water boards, all of them have this sort of very narrow mandate of providing water, supplying water. That's the thinking that seems to be there. There's no sort of integrated framework for water governance, right? Now, of course, interestingly, now we hear increasingly how the idea of integrated water development is what we should, integrated urban water development is path to take. Our law policy frameworks don't, policy, there's been a bit of change, but at least our legal frameworks haven't changed. So there's no real integrated framework to look at water in a holistic way, which looks at water supply, ground regulation, rainwater harvesting, wastewater treatment, lake management. All of these are relevant parts of the water urban water governance ambit, but these are not thought through separately. So this is an image of the number of agencies that are there for, this is based on a research that Well Labs have done. So I'm attributing it to that. I didn't prepare this. So if you look at this sort of list the number of agencies which are responsible for various aspects of water supply that are there, right? And okay, yeah, number of agencies that are responsible for water supply, and yeah, and how that sort of still, there's no real scope for integration between this. If at all there's any integration, that is only at the state level. What I'm trying to indicate here is that the local governance system or the urban governance system under the municipality and the water governance system is not joined together in many cities, including the city that I'm studying here, in this case, Bangalore. It's not clearly brought together. Okay. Now, what are the other kinds of challenges regarding water regulation and water law that we see? This is just one example, and there can be many more examples like this. This is about buffer zone regulation and of stormwater drains. An example of how the master plan seeks to do something, and then you have a whole ambit of other sort of institutions trying to do something else. So just very quickly, the master plan for Bangalore, 2015, created certain buffer zones, 30-meter buffer zone for the lakes, and 50 meters and 25 meters and 15 meters buffer zone for what are called Rajkolbes or stormwater drains. That was the buffer zone system. But this buffer zone, obviously, this all kinds of development is actually restricted in these buffer zones. Now, these buffer zones were not implemented. As anyone who's walked around the city will know that all our constructions are next to these Rajkolbes, or stormwater drains. So it's not really implemented in any sort of serious way. So against this sort of system, people went to court asking for it to be implemented. They went to court, and I also went to the National Green Tribunal. National Green Tribunal suddenly came up with new regulations. They said, let's actually say that for water there should be slightly different. One is it imposed penalties for people who violate, but it also provided for a new buffer zone sort of system, 75 meters for lakes, and 50 to 25 meters for Rajkolbes, right? So it actually increased the ambit of the buffer zone. Now, the government of Karnataka actually appealed the verdict of the National Green Tribunal, saying that, what are you doing? And they went to Supreme Court. Supreme Court basically said that the master plan regulation is the one that should continue and not the NGT order. This is just an instance of how contested the nature of and how sort of conflictory sort of relationships exist within, agencies of the state, when you're defining these bonds, and the absence of clarity allows, for all kinds of regulatory uncertainty, right? Which also promotes, violation of some of these norms. Very quickly on urban groundwater regulation, this is something I'm very, interested in, because this is one, in the context of the Bangalore crisis, people started talking about urban groundwater regulation. We really don't have a, good urban groundwater regulatory setup, in India. We have certain norms, we have certain laws, we have a model norm, but in terms of how the groundwater is regulated in our system, we are still governed by one of the oldest legislations that still exists. Now that we are in the mode of decolonizing our laws, and we are, sort of changing the names at least of many of our old laws and come up with new laws. I can't name them because it's hard for me to remember the very Sanskritized Hindi names of these laws. But even while all of that exists, we have something called the Indian Easements Act of 1882, which recognizes water as an easement associated with land and ownership of land. What does it say? Basically, Section 7 of the Easements Act says that it is the right of the owner of every land to collect and dispose within his own limits of all water under the land. Basically, this is an old idea of, easements. If you own a piece of land, you have everything above it and everything under it, right? So you can extract as much as you want without any limit, and you can, continue to use it in whichever way you. So this is of course been a major sort of source of conflict, and there have been some cases which have come up on this. In fact, the Transfer of Property Act also further strengthens this way of looking at stuff. But I don't want to get into the details there. So this has been questioned. If you look at the famous Coca-Cola case, where a Gram Panchayat, that is the Perumatti Gram Panchayat versus Coca-Cola, they contested Coca-Cola's right to dig as much and take water as much as it wants. There have been efforts. I mean, let me not completely sort of let me also give the devil to you. There have been efforts to regulate groundwater. There's been a model bill to regulate groundwater that came in 1960 that has been updated multiple times. There's a new one. I'll speak about that right in the end. But this is if you look at most groundwater regulations of state, it's based on this act, and it maintains. But the problem with this legislation is that it still maintains the right to extract groundwater and its connection with the right to land, right? So that's the sort of slight concern that it raises. So yeah, and also there is the question of access to water is important because access to groundwater is important because access to groundwater is directly linked with the access to water per se, which is a fundamental right. In certain cases, we have held access to water as a fundamental right. So the regulation of that and the need to provide water in a realistic way, as opposed to the ability to extract as much as you want and go against the aquifer systems that we have and empty the aquifers. It's something you need to actually control through law, and we still don't have very good measures on it. We'll get to, when we discuss further, we'll see how some of these can change. Okay, so I've done with my first part and second part. I'm on to my last part, which is looking at alternative frameworks. I was largely critiquing the existing frameworks. Now we're looking at alternative frameworks for both water governance, urban planning, and urban governance broadly. So I'd go in the reverse order because I've been discussing water. I'll start with water and then get into urban planning and governance, right? So in this next, I think about 10 minutes, I hope to look at, frameworks of water, what is a water law and governance framework that is possible. Then look at trends regarding water-sensitive urban planning and climate action plans that are emerging. And then look at alternative legal frameworks for master plans that we can think about. And then finally look at what an integrated planning and governance framework for water and urban might look like. So that's the structure of the last leg of this talk. So on water law and governance, right? I don't want to get too much into this because, I am aware that I'm already about, running about 4 minutes behind my own internal schedule. So on water law and governance, as I mentioned, the problem with the present water regulations that we have, state-based water regulations that we have, is that they don't really challenge the Eastman Sachs imagination of water, right? So land ownership, water, that link seems to be there. The idea of aquifer-wide protections is not really there now. It is actually, this sort of thinking is coming through now. If you look at the model groundwater regulation, sort of sustainable management bill 2017, you see that you're recognizing even groundwater as under the doctrine of public trust, right? As opposed to any kind of, so that's a big change that we're seeing. And so it's important, I think I argue, that groundwater should be treated as a common resource and not something that you can extract without any basis. You see some of these things emerging in some of the legislations. There's also an idea of having a water framework bill to bring various aspects of water together. There's been suggestions by Mayor Shah Committee and others on having a National Water Commission that brings together both the Central Water Commission as well as the Central Groundwater Board, right, as in a single institutional framework. So now we see some efforts to have water sensitive urban planning. So the water governance legislative framework sort of exists on one side. There's also some efforts to create water sensitive urban planning that is emerging. You see, new plans, for example, trying to promote what is called blue-green infrastructure. You see that if you look at the URDPFI guidelines and the Urban Regional Development Plan Formulation and Implementation Guidelines, which is issued in 2015, you see that it says that the master plan should actually consider blue-green infrastructure. So hence, if you look at the Delhi master plan, for example, you see blue-green infrastructure there. If you see other kinds of initiatives, for example, Kochi's local biodiversity and strategy action plan, you see efforts to create Kochi into a sponge city, right? Under this BGI, blue-green infrastructure framework, right? So you see all of these efforts emerging. This is emerging along with what I call as city-level climate action and resilience projects that are emerging, right? I'm sure many of you are aware that not only do we have national action, plans for climate change and state action plans for climate change. Now, increasingly, we are seeing city-based, climate action plans for climate change, right? So, city-based climate action plans. So Mumbai was one of the first ones which initiated this with the Mumbai Climate Action Plan. You see this similar exercise being initiated, for example, in Bangalore. We now have a Bangalore Climate Action Plan. Other cities, you keep seeing what are called various types of resilience project, climate resilience projects, water resilience projects emerging. But what is interesting about all these efforts? Firstly, all these efforts are good. There's no question about it. We should have them. It's great. But what is interesting is that most of these efforts are driven completely by international networks and donor agencies. And these don't emerge out of any sort of local initiative itself or the city itself thinking we should have this, right? There is often a international NGO or a global sort of alliance through which this is formed, and then of course the whole climate action, all this is then done by a different agency in the outside, and then they operate with the local government and prepare it, right? So there's it's outsourced, but no, outsourced to a different degree. Meaning it's not outsourced as in you set the norms and you outsource it. The very idea of doing this often comes from the outside, right? Which is all fine. The only problem is that then there's no real ownership, right? There's no real ownership. There's no real integration with the existing policies or legislative or policy schemes that the local governments have, right? So these often exist as fragmented systems. They look great. The presentations look very snazzy and everything, but in terms of actual scope of it, we don't know. It's quite early to say this because these action plans have only started coming in the last couple of years, so it's still early to say this. But I would say that its scope seems to be something quite fragmented and something that really does not matter that much to the local government, and is not. So you have climate action plans which exist completely separately from any other planning frameworks that the local government might have, right? And broadly, I think in India there is also while all of these, there's a lot of attention on climate change. Legislatively, we don't have any comprehensive law which tackles climate change. Our environmental laws don't really speak about climate change or climate resilience or any of these things in a major ways, right? So it's all, international policy level, initiatives that we see, and not anything coming from below. I think that really, sort of, asks, I mean, that's something that we really need to consider, right? If we just do something which is emerging from, international sort of examples, how does that work, right? So the previous slide was just indicating that there's been a shift to thinking about alternative frameworks that are there. I mean, it was speaking about how, say, including the 12th 5-year plan spoke about rethinking the master plan as a device, right? Maybe I'll just go to the previous slide itself. So yeah, so it says that the master plan concept is not suitable for rapidly growing cities in India. We need to think of other frames. Increasingly, there's a realization that the way planning is done, you need to think beyond the current frameworks. Niti Aayog's Reforms in Urban Planning Capacity Report, as well as the High Level Committee on Urban Planning, all of them indicate an inadequacy of the current approaches, right? And look at alternative frameworks. What are the alternative frameworks which are out there? Globally, we see strategic spatial plan as a major alternative that is there. It looks at integrating, economic strategies and urban development projects within the spatial development framework, and establishes long-term strategies that are there. I think what is important in some of these new frameworks is that it links the spatial plan with the actual sectoral plan, right? And also, most importantly, and I think this is possibly even more important, right? Is that it links the plan outcomes and the plan sort of goals with budgets, right? How is it financially supported? How can you sort of bring these things together? So there's more what I call action oriented with links to budgets and projects, emerging in alternative frameworks. I don't want to get into which all countries are doing it. I'll just cite one of them, which is the South African case. South Africa has something called integrated development plans, which I think it's quite fascinating. I mean, instead of citing some global north case, I think it's important to look at examples like South Africa. This IDP framework speaks about a statutory 5-year strategic plan, right? It's a statutory plan and not the kinds of plans we have now, which are not statutory, right? The only statutory plan we have is the master plan. So this is a statutory 5-year strategic plan, which actually brings various aspects of the city together, and also connects the development projects with the annual budget of the city government. So I think, if you're looking at addressing these issues, the overall frame that I'm arriving at is that if you want to address water, if you want to address climate change, if you want to address other kinds of aspects into the thing, you need to bring these things together, right? Consolidation of various planning, institutions and initiatives is something that we need to think about. I'm just citing an example here. This is not a water example, but it's an example of how legislative frames, can bring multiple plans together. This is an example of transport. I know it's a different sector, but it's something that we can learn from. For example, there's been a lot of talk as after transit-oriented development and all of that. There's a lot of talk around bringing integration of land use and transport planning, right? So something like the Bangalore Metropolitan Land Transport Authority was part. I mean, it's it's a new legislation that is there. It seeks to integrate the land use plan with the mobility plan in a very sort of systematic way. It says I'm just quoting here, and it's really important for us to remember this. It says that the planning authority has to consult the transport authority before it makes a plan, right? It also says that the transport authority can make suggestions, directly to the planning authority, and those suggestions have to be considered and incorporated by the plan, and look at what it says. Where such suggestions are not incorporated, the planning authority shall provide a detailed explanation for its reasons for why it did not incorporate. Right? So this is just an example of how strategic planning and how spatial planning and sectoral planning can come together. I'll just take maybe 1 or 2 minutes, Srinivas, and and wind it up. So
Sure.
you see, yeah, because I know I'm already about 4 or 5 minutes overshot my time. So very quickly, you have examples like the very different example of a Kerala Town and Country Planning Act. I don't want to get into the details there. It actually goes quite a bit under the it's I mean, it's something to look at because it goes beyond the Model Town Planning Act of 1960 and takes the URDPFI guidelines from 2014 as a base and develops a law around it. And if you look at the kinds of contents that is there in this law, it is slightly broader. I'm saying it goes beyond the land use framing and considers other frames also. The other important thing about this is this law integrates the Metropolitan Planning Committee, District Planning Committee, and local government within the planning framework, as opposed to what we have as development authorities planning, right? So this is the larger critique, how urban planning, environment, and urban governance seek to sort of operate parallelly now, and there's no integration. And what I'm proposing, this is my second last slide, is what I call an integrated planning and governance framework, where, which addresses this lack of coordination between spatial plans, sectoral plans, and municipal budgets. So all of this calls for a new planning framework that integrates spatial and non-spatial plans and tie it with financial allocations. Because, ultimately, if you want to empower something, you have to put money there, right? That's the only way, if you speak to any bureaucrat, the respect a person gets is about how much money he or she has to dispense with, right? Within the bureaucratic system. So that's the sort of core thing to think about. So in that way, you can actually integrate these systems. And this is the last slide. I'm just taking this image from the protests in Delhi regarding that flooding that happened, with the question, who is responsible? I think it is important for us to take this question seriously. Who's responsible, right? When we are looking at who's responsible, we need to rethink the way systems are organized here. We need to assign clear ownership of governance and accountability, to the right agencies. If you go by what I'm saying, my suggestion is a strengthened urban governance framework that with financial and human capacity, which integrates spatial planning, socioeconomic planning, climate action, and water management in a common framework. This is possible, right? I mean, some of the examples of South African stuff, it seems to do some of it, right? So, but the point is, that integration can not only happen purely at the planning level, that has to happen also at a governance level, right? And only if you integrate, and hence it's a bigger order task. It's not easy. It's not a small thing we can do. So the reform will have more sort of people who will question it. But I feel if you do that, then the plan itself can be a key tool for integration. And all of this requires if this has to happen, you need political authority to be clearly vested in the local government with ownership, where the local government takes ownership over both planning, water, and other aspects like climate change. So that's the way I feel we can possibly go. As I said, it's exploratory, and you can have questions about it. But yeah, so I'll stop. And sorry for taking about, I think, 6-7 minutes extra, but I'll stop. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Matthew. I mean, it's quite an arc that you have tried to trace out. First, start with the history of town planning instruments, and then the water governance framework, and then come to the alternative urban planning and governance framework. I'm so glad that you went beyond what we started with, the statutory master plan, the legal instrument, and then emphasize the idea of the governance framework as well. I think this is where the dilemma lies. You see, the earlier talks that you did listen to, there are these arguments. There are two completely opposite arguments. One is that this is fairly adequate instrument. It's often the problem of how we deploy the instrument. There are adequate possibilities of innovation and innovation in practice, as well as planning techniques that can address this water-centric urban planning, which basically means that it can range from water security, drinking water security, to also coping with the risks of urban floods, as well as maintaining or managing these water bodies, whether it is stationary water bodies or otherwise flowing water bodies like rivers. Now, this whole range of challenges that are associated with urban governance, if you look at it, then the kind of examples that you mentioned, you started off with the Delhi and Bangalore. And if you look at it, The Delhi, it's not just floods. Just before 1 month before the floods, it had this drought situation where the minister for Delhi went on hunger strike, accusing the upstream state of Haryana not releasing water for its needs. And the moment floods come in, not the recent floods, but then the previous in 2023 when it happened, it required certain amount of coordination with the upstream Hatnikund barrage, which is also managed by other kind of institutions. So there are this whole range of issues that we want to sort of accommodate or otherwise address. We want them to be addressed by the statutory instrument of master plan. I mean, there are two approaches that I see. I'm sorry for this long question, but one is that you accept that there are limits to the master plan, that the way it is structured and the kind of rationalities that were used to structure that instrument. And then look at this alternative supplemental, either planning interventions or otherwise governance interventions or institutional intervention, or attempt an integrated planning framework, which in my view, there is certain experiments that can help us. Now, for example, the Bombay planning framework, if you look at it, that could be helpful. In your view, what do you think, which way to go? I mean, I know that there is middle ground that you want to explore, but I would like you to articulate a bit more. Then we can take these questions that are there in the Q&A.
Thanks, Srinivas. I think it's thanks for the response, and it's a very important question. I feel personally, of course, I feel it is something. If you really want to respond to the situation, we need to go with an integrated framework. Is what I think. But I'm also acutely aware of the challenges in doing that. Right. I mean, not because I'm not looking at this purely from a sort of academic or scholarly point of view. I've been involved in certain efforts to reform governance systems, in Bangalore, for example, and the kinds of challenges to transform it within the system, outside the system is extremely high, right? So you need some sort of extreme amount of, you should be robust or anti-fragile, to use some term, to be able to withstand that and still try to make this happen, right? So I know that integrated framework challenge is high, meaning to make that happen is more difficult. So what is often possible is that we understand this, we aim for that, sort of for a later phase, we always put that this is where we want to reach, but in the meantime, still try to, because the values you're talking about, whether it's about water sensitivity or climate resilience, those values are still relevant. You can still try to push it within the existing frameworks, right? So it's obviously not one or the other. It's a strategic move to I feel we should push for it, at least, as on a principled sense, and if you are a person who thinks about it principally and not purely pragmatically, on a principled sense, there is a need to push for it and sort of demonstrate what is possible and show that this is not some sort of utopia which cannot exist. It can happen. The examples, Bombay, for example, or even some of the things which are done in Kerala, for example, that indicate that some of these things are possible, right? So push for that, but in the meantime, whenever a new planning framework comes or whenever a new master plan is made, work with that framework, what you have, and then still try to push for a broader framework within it. My only pushback against making this broader framework is this what I indicated as a literature thing, right? Some of these efforts by civil society and others to make all the great things find a place in the plan. The planners are very smart to somehow include it within that vision framework and then ignore it in the development control regulations, right? So I think it's also important to not just get your favorite topic in that nice sounding literature, the vision framework, and also have it in the actual technicalities and instrumentalities of plan, which is there in the DCR and other kinds of frameworks. So as I said, so my response is sort of slightly long-winded response, but is that you have to do both, but in a very sort of systematic way. Not that okay, yeah, this is there is it. Have a long-term plan to do this, but at the same time, when opportunities come in, try to incorporate these ideas into the existing frameworks also.
Well, I'm tempted to ask you, take it further and then ask you questions about what is stopping the urban local bodies, which are actually trying to deal crisis on, at least if not on daily basis, but at least on annual basis. But then we can come back to it.
Yeah.
Perhaps you would like to look at the Q&As in the Q&A
Yeah.
space.
There are a lot of questions. I don't know, maybe, I'm not able to, I'm just looking at it now. So yeah, maybe they can, speak, or, do you have this? There are 7 or 8 questions.
Right.
Hmm.
This is a general question about how many cities are actually following the master plan. Even
Right.
in, I mean, this is something that we have addressed in earlier talks.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
very often, at least I tend to uh, take the position that they do follow. I mean, unless you want to take up this and address it, please. I
no,
was
no.
thinking a
So
bit more.
that's fine. I mean, yeah.
So they do follow. It's just that
Yeah.
there are spillovers, which the question is whether master plan accommodates that or not, which are
Hmm. Okay.
not into concerns. But the other one is, do you think that the appropriate tariffs and retail pricing of water will align the incentives of various stakeholders to bring about? I mean, I don't know whether
Hmm.
it's a water pricing question that comes, whether you want to
Hmm.
handle it.
Yeah, I think just maybe a quick response on that. I think water pricing can, I mean, firstly, I mean, let's accept the kind of water pricing that we have in our cities. We are all beneficiaries of it. If you have a pipe water supply, we are all beneficiaries of it. I am a beneficiary of it, living in Indiranagar in Bangalore, getting to, pipe water supply. But it's unfair, right? It's the price you pay is not the price that actually sort of is involved. We are being heavily subsidized, and honestly, any water approach has to directly tackle this. I mean, yes, I mean, a couple of days back there was the announcement that they will change this, but there's going to be resistance to this, right? So what we are doing is the poor, who are actually often reliant on other sources of non-piped water, they pay more, right, as opposed to what pipe water supply provides for. So I think it cannot be purely addressed from a cost sort of tariff perspective, but I think you need a more rationalized approach in this in water pricing. The present approach, benefits seems quote unquote socialistic, agenda behind it, but the actual beneficiaries are somebody else, right? So obviously you need to go beyond it, but to what extent you go by a pure sort of demand supply pricing model, I'm not sure, and you need to obviously account for people who may not be able to purchase it at the market price, all of that. So, but I think maybe we can have differential pricing or differential sort of supply. Then obviously the identification of beneficiaries, all those questions come in. Obviously, it's not an easy problem, but I think it's something that an overall water framework should look at. The simple point here basically being, now we have a BWSSB or a water supply board or a Delhi Jal board, as we see there, who's only largely concerned with water supply. You're not looking at other sources of water. If you have a sort of overall water as a regulatory source and that framework, then these questions can possibly be addressed better. Yeah.
Right. The next question actually is kind of related to that. I mean, it is
Yeah.
the pricing is something that depends on measurement, monitoring, and audits. But I think if you want to look at it and there
Yeah.
is a specific point,
Yeah.
but otherwise,
Okay, it's interesting. It speaks about moving from a polluter pay principle to a precautionary principle. I think Pinaki, I think it's an interesting point. I've not really thought about this, because I would say that the the polluter pay principles and precautionary principles, both strong sort of principles in environmental law that that actually guide many of these sort of systems. But um, I would say, if possible, yeah, I think it might be a good idea to look at a transition in that way. I'm not sure if what all are the implications of the way water will be priced and regulated in that framework. But yeah, I think it's something I'll just, even for further, sort of thinking, I'll make a note of it. I think it's something to look at. Yeah.
so the next question is about the Easement Act and the way you
Oh, right.
mentioned that
Yeah.
is the access to groundwater
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
as defined by the Easement Act. Do you think that the government should regulate when the groundwater that is accessible
Yeah.
as an easement right?
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
think the
Yeah.
government?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's Ojasvi. Thanks for the question. I think so, definitely. I think I mean, if you look at globally everywhere, we are moving beyond this. As I said, the kinds of decolonization of laws we are doing seems to be, of a different kind. This Indian Eastman's Act of 1882 is I mean, I'm not saying whole Eastman Act should be, given some Sanskrit name and all of that now, but I'm just saying that we need to definitely go beyond that sort of framework where you have extreme amount of sort of unfettered right to take water from below your land, because as people have realized now, there are aquifer systems. It's not like, if you dig from land if it's under the same water aquifer, you can be taking away land water availability from your nearby areas. So if you look at this groundwater model groundwater regulation that has come in, from 2016, I feel I mean, I've not studied all aspects of it, but it seems to, go in the right direction. You're looking at groundwater also from a public trust doctrine, right? Meaning it's a common resource. It's something you're holding in trust. It's not something that is something which is not necessarily tied to land. If you tie to land, it also means that people who have access to land have access to water. People who don't have access to land don't have access to water, which goes against your right to life and right to have water as for your daily sort of purpose, right? So hence there are all kinds of constitutional as well as other reasons why you definitely need to go beyond this. What is the way in which you can go is there are multiple ways to do it. I think the groundwater regulation sort of model one from 2016-17 seems to be somewhat on the right track. There are also other examples to look at. Actually, I didn't have a time to cite this because while making PPT, I realized that I've already, it's a bit too long. So there is something called adaptive water management, and there are laws for adaptive water management, for example, in New South Wales, in Australia, as well as in British Columbia and in Canada, right? This speaks about the fact that water availability actually keeps, changing. So you can't fix water availability, in any sort of fixed space. So you need to actually change it. So I've not studied these legislations in detail, but my sense is, maybe it's not the right time to talk about it because we're not anywhere close to that. We still are governed by an 1882 kind of thing. So we need to first move beyond that and then start, looking at after exercising, after creating these systems, how can we, look at adaptive water management, from a law policy lens. So yes, I definitely feel we need to move beyond, and I think we already have frames, the existing the model groundwater regulations, which are model because the groundwater regulations that we have in states are based on the previous 1970 version of groundwater regulation, right? So it is not the 2014 version of the 2016 version of the model regulations, and hence I think it's time to sort of move beyond that.
Well, the thing that we started with, Mukta, is asking about what's
right.
stopping Indian states.
Right. That's what Srinivas, you're also asking. Yeah. So Mukta is asking about what is stopping states from adapting strategic planning? And can there be legal frameworks for it? So I mean, firstly, it's something we need to ask the government and people in the government itself. And since my sense is that. Actually a strategic planning framework is not something in my sort of sense. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm 100% correct, but my sense is a strategic planning framework where strategic spatial plans for these projects that can be made and stuff. This is something that the government may not be completely opposed to. Because you can actually, in a strategic spatial planning framework, you can actually have major projects being, indicated in various parts, and then that can, be a sort of, way in which you can promote it. But a more integrated framework that actually changes the way integration happens, and what I am proposing, which is about integration at the city government level, that obviously there's going to be a ton of opposition to it, because that completely changes the way the political economy of how things are done, which will empower the local, which means usually the chief minister, or in this case the deputy chief minister, controls the city. The control of the state level over the land market gets disturbed. And why would you want to do that? You can do strategic spatial planning. You might be okay with it as long as it's directly under the state. So my sense is if it's under the state, it's possible to be done within the existing political economy sort of sort of systems. But if you're actually changing that, there's going to be, I can't reveal all the kinds of information I've had, but yeah, it's
add a
going to be,
supplemental question there. I mean,
yeah.
if you could, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the recent amended town planning acts, like the
Yeah.
Bihar one,
Yeah.
2002.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with those amendments? Have they tried
Just
to
very
do
briefly.
it?
Yeah. I've
Have
seen
they
it. Yeah.
tried to do it? Could you just share your thoughts about
Yeah.
why they could not do it if they did not do it, or otherwise, what is it that they could do when
Yeah.
they revisited the town planning framework?
I think there is already, if you look at the Bihar one, or even if you look at the Kerala one, which I cited, there seems to be a recognition of this change that is needed to look at slightly more comprehensive planning and all of that. But even, I'm more familiar with the Kerala legislation. Even in that context, you see that the planning framework is great, but what the government is happy to do is they still want to use the old system, whereby planning is carried out, because there's a long history of community-based planning for socioeconomic planning, not for spatial planning. So they're happy to continue with that, which is a great system that we have. And then the master plan has always been some sort of an evil sort of twin of the socioeconomic plan that is there in that state, at least, right? So at least from the people's mind, socioeconomic planning, they're very happy with it, and this great sort of participatory exercise. But the master plan is the evil twin. So when this sort of new legislation came up in the context of the URDPFI sort of based 2014 model, there was a lot of opposition to it. I think, because, so the plan actually came in. I mean, the plan legislation came in, but in terms of how it is actually carried out, there's been hardly any master plan in the last 7 years made under this framework, right? So there is still challenge in doing this, maybe because of multiple reasons, and good reasons, bad reasons, all of them. I think Debashri also wanted to respond to that question, I think.
You want to that? Not sure we can. Well, not sure she's there, but maybe in the meantime, you can, Debashri, please come back if you want to respond to that. There are two questions about climate change, the intersection of climate change and water. I think if you want to take it as that.
Yeah. I'm just
Pinaki's and Kundan's questions. One
Yeah.
about whether water is is a subset of climate change issues. Is it not being reflected in the climate change texts? I thought they are, but perhaps not adequately. One. And the other one is the provocative statement that you mentioned about how these climate action plans. Do you think that is there any potential for these climate action plans to help, or otherwise they're just being fragmented by the international?
Yeah. Thanks. I think important questions. I think water is very much part of these climate action plan initiatives. Very interestingly enough, if you look at the Delhi master plan, it has a whole section on climate and environment, and it speaks about the BGI framework. But then under the water structure is within the physical infrastructure framework, right? In that chapter. So that I found that ordering of within the master plan quite interesting, right? Because it all of that came under the physical infrastructure. But that's just an aside.
That is a reflection of not having climate change and water
Exactly
incorporated in it, because that is that's the original template of master.
Exactly. So in some ways, some of that seems to be continuing. But on this international agenda, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist and foreign hand or any of these things, in this midst, especially, in the context we are in, So, I'm, not trying to attribute anything like that. It's just a sense of disappointment, meaning it comes out of that. It's just that it's we have international groups, all great, all friends, honestly. So I don't want to, speak against any of them. It's all good stuff we're doing, but it is so externally driven, right? It is so externally driven that it never becomes. It looks great, and I've gone for one or two of these presentations. It looks fascinating, but it never becomes fully incorporated either into your planning device or your city's governance system, or the most importantly, where money goes, right, within the budgetary framework. There have been efforts. There have been some efforts. The Mumbai thing, as I said, it's early days. So, we don't know what will actually happen. Maybe the skepticism may prove to be wrong, maybe it will be adopted because, for example, the way the Mumbai, at least the way they spoke about it initially, and especially the previous government with Aditya Thackeray heading environment and all of that, there was some sort of ownership over environment that was being thought about, right? So possibly it can be, integrated, but I just feel, at least in the present structure, these climate action plans, though there is some sort of ownership which is kept at the level of the city, but at least in the way it is not been incorporated. So that's the sort of challenge that is there. Yeah.
Right. So there are, I think,
there are a few more questions. Yeah.
there are quite a few. I mean, there are 14 now. They have increased to 14.
Oh,
so
okay.
They addressed about 8 of them.
Okay. Is there a way to access these questions? I don't know. Maybe
You can't. You can't. I thought that you were actually reading it. Q&A.
No, I can see. No. I'm saying when the talk ends, the question disappears. That's
Oh,
So,
that I think we can help you out with it.
right.
Certainly. But I think we do have time. We can go ahead and extend
Yeah.
minutes to address these.
The
other question is,
can I chip in, Srinivas?
no, I see you. Please hold it. Let's give it order of questions that appeared in the Q&A. We will come back. I see that there is a message that came. We will come back to you, Pushpaji. So there is this question about community-centric approach for managing water resources. Ostrom, that fascination with Lynn Ostrom's community-centric approach continues. I wonder about those community institutions in urban areas, which are increasingly becoming remote to the sources that they are dependent on. But it's your call whether you want to respond to that.
Yeah, just quickly, I think, because we're running out, I think I'll just respond to these questions like 1 minute type, responses. So I think there is, Elinor Ostrom's and others sort of framework is something that can be looked at. But I would say even Ostrom's framework, because I don't want to get into a large, sort of discussion or critique of the Ostrom framework, but it's no time for that. But even there, in terms of the way the co-governance is thought about, right? It still seems to sort of, not account. I mean, it obviously has the original framework comes from a very global north sort of perspective, but now there have been people who worked with her. Say, for example, Harini Nagendra's work with Ostrom looks at it in the global south context. But one of the issues around who gets to be part of these forums, who gets to be part of these co-governance, initiatives, and how does that actually affect the way, for example, lake governance is organized? I think that's something we need to be really acutely aware of, because some of these, I don't want to get into the details here, but some of these lake governance initiatives, which are co-governance and has all these great principles in where the community and the state and the local government, everyone comes together, and the RW, everyone comes together. But some of these had impacts which have had an exclusionary sort of basis. It sort of developed the area in a particular way, so maybe it didn't sort of take in people in the way it's supposed to. Anyway, so there is a possibility you need to bring the community in, but how do you do it? Whether and who are the actors who get a chance is something we need to possibly consider.
Well, there are the other questions. Some of them are comments, but one question is that it's about the multi-jurisdictional coordination. There are agencies with jurisdictions and unwilling to really collaborate. What's the way forward?
Which one is this? Whose is this?
By Smriti Kopika.
Smriti's question. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is it. I mean, Smriti's question. Thanks, Smriti, for the question. I think this is the biggest challenge that we need to work around with. As I said, there are multiple agencies who are not willing to collaborate. Sometimes there is certain incentives which allow them to collaborate. It's so ultimately from whatever limited engagement with government, I realize it's incentive structures which make people collaborate, and the question, as I said, regarding who controls the money, right? So if you can have, say, for example, now the CFC sort of discussions are going on around 16th FC, right? Around, funding, money, I mean, directly to states, all of that. And sorry, directly to cities, for example. This is the whole idea that you'll even have, funding, conditional funding for new cities, right? This is the kind of stuff that MOUD used to do. Now even CFC is coming up with a plan to build new cities and fund directly, right? So I'm saying it's a heavily centralized sort of option. I'm not a big fan of centralization, if you might have guessed it. But even then, right? Even then, you're having conditions about how money can come in, and you're mentioning this is the way to do it. If you put money into, say, if this say CFC grants or SSC grants are, because you have slightly quote unquote enlightened minds there, right? If it can actually provide, say, that the money directly goes to the, say, the local government with an elected body, and then then you have to come to the table. If it comes like that, then other agencies would be sort of forced to come to the table, because they know that only with the approval of the local government will the other agency actually be able to operate. And I feel that will allow, that's the only way in which I feel this sort of collaboration is possible. Otherwise, because integration structures, we can talk about it. I've had experience of trying to make it happen, but unless there is actual financial backing to this, and then when there is money, you respect it. That's even how I've noticed it, how bureaucrats operate. That person is actually controlling this. He has the purse, then it works. So I just feel it's sort of structured around that. Yeah.
Here is a question supplementary, is that what if there are greater incentives to not to collaborate?
Yeah, I guess. Well, if like what could it be? Like,
like the Delhi one, if
Oh, right. I mean, Delhi one, I really can't, say anything about it. I mean, all I can say is, I mean, I don't want to say, I mean, the only thing I can say is you guys are screwed, but I can't say that. So, all I can say is that it's a very sort of, the incentive structures there are obviously something you can't change, right? It's the only way for that to change is if you have a, maybe a triple engine sarkar or something, maybe,
I think
yeah,
I think going what you said is that going beyond
yeah,
beyond the defined
yeah,
contours, then
yeah,
look for those institutional spaces that facilitate
yeah,
this institutional coordination, maybe one.
yeah.
And one last question, and then we can go to Dr. Pushpa's question. One is this question about again, what if there is a mismatch between your alternative framework by Dr. Chathukulam and the capacity of the city government itself? This is one of those critical issues about governance, is that
Mm.
uh, do the city governments have the capacity
Yeah, of course.
that
Yeah,
require addressing these emerging challenges with the
yeah,
different scales of coordination and
yeah,
different kinds of challenges?
yeah. Absolutely. Thanks, Dr. Jose. Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, maybe it wasn't very clear in that slide. I mentioned it requires a new integrated framework where the capacity, which includes the physical capacity and the human capacity, which means, that has to change, right? Because now, of course, you're completely reliant, on a parallel framework. You need the, sort of structures from the state to operate. For example, even in Kerala, you'll see, I mean, you'll see that, it's the Kerala Water Authority, or the kinds of expertise is all at the state level. And then, you don't actually have local capacity to do, say, planning. You don't, I mean, I'm sure, I mean, this has been done to the death, the lack of planners in our city governments, all of that, right? So how does that capacity emerge? You need a focused attention in creating it. That capacity would need funding. So we come back to the funding question about trying to actually start a completely, a new funding model which enables the city to, expand its capacity. It's not easy. I mean, as I said, these things would definitely take time, but I just feel if we start some of those conversations around how to do that, maybe we might get somewhere. But yeah, I completely agree. You can't do this if you don't have the financial or human capacity, which is why it needs to start by, we need to start by first adding that, and then moving forward in that direction.
We'll just take one more question from the Zoom, and then we'll go to Dr. Pushpas as a final question. This is from Champaka. How would large real estate businesses, which largely occupy peri-urban areas informally in our cities, respond to integrating groundwater governance with spatial planning?
Yeah. Yeah,
How
thanks.
can, how
Yeah.
can planning regulation help address this problem, which is also a
Hmm.
land question?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I think it's a, I mean, beyond the real estate sort of question, there's a lot of work, on how for example, the land mafia and the water mafia are extremely linked, right? And the fact that the water supply is actually connected with the land, who has control over land is controlling the water question, right? So we know examples where you go to peri-urban areas, occupy, buy those lands, use that as a way to, dig bore wells and fill your tanks and then supply it. That's the business model. It's a real estate, water mafia, or whatever you want to call it, linked business model. It is going, it's going untrammeled, without any kind of control over this. Only if you actually have these, what I'm calling as this, going beyond this Eastman Act and have these frameworks which regulate this, and then have somebody, being brave enough to implement it. That's the only way in which this can be, responded to. So in that way, of course, any framework of this will upset the many of the real estate interests that are already there in the city, who might already have access land and have dig huge bore wells, which is actually supplying water to the tankers, and then it's all connected in that sort of framework. So yeah, so yeah, it's a difficult thing to bite, but I guess you need to do that.
Pushpaji, Dr. Pushpa.
Thank you, Srinivas. I think last question actually links up very well to what I am going to ask, because the complexity of urban governance and water governance has been highlighted very well by Matthew. Thank you for that. But there is another issue here that needs to be highlighted, and that's as an issue of scale. Master plans are at the local level. Water governance is at the regional level. How do we link the two? Master plan is not the right tool. That debate is outdated. We have already talked about it. I think I mentioned it to Srinivas. We have to go to the regional level. And we have also talked to some of the TREDS team people when they had come to meet me, that we have to think of regional development plans and water governance. At the city level, it's extremely limited. We have to find the two, and that answers the question about managing water in peri-urban areas. Until we include water governance at the regional level, this issue of integrating sectoral planning, strategic planning, financial planning at the local level would also have limited impact. Thank you.
Thanks. I think it's a very good point, observation, and question. I completely agree. But the only sort of response to that is that the way we look at master planning now, as a land use based master plan within a city, is mostly at a local scale. But as we know, if you look at whether it is the URDPFI guidelines or the examples that are there is a lot of instances of providing for multiple scales of planning, right? So at each of these scales, you have political authorities that are there, right? For example, you can have a district scale, you have a metropolitan scale. Now, I mean, of course, all of this is easier said than done. No questions about it. This, we exist in, not in a world of, just systems and processes, but we exist in some sort of a game theory sort of world where, different agencies are pulling things in different ways for multiple incentives and reasons. So all of those, with all those caveats, clearly there is still options for having planning and governance at multiple scale. So planning and governance at multiple scales would be not that everything is integrated only at one scale. You can have integration, and by the way, there's no idea that everything will just be integrated and that's it, right? For example, some of the things around water I'm talking about in terms of the water law and water governance, and for example, the Water Regulation Act and the Water Commission, all of that has to exist independently, of the master planning, meaning that will look at it at a not just a regional scale, sometimes at a state level scale, right? because it's a regulation across the state. So certain things like, certain regulations that you're talking about are at the state level, are at a much wider scale, and the water sector and water regulations regarding all of that will exist there, which will apply across. Then you have scales of planning. So everything is not in, I'm not saying everything should be integrated with the plan. Some of the water regulatory examples should exist independently, with its own independent regulation. The water regulation that I'm talking, the groundwater regulation, as well as a framework water law. There's been a lot of talk around a framework water law and a framework climate law. I'm not saying these are, silver bullets by any stretch of the imagination, but definitely something we can consider, right? So the simple response to that is some of these larger questions need to be definitely tackled at the state level or at a regional level. The regional level question comes in where you can still have planning at multiple scales. You can have even under the URDPFI and even under 74th, you see that there's a metropolitan scale, there's a city scale, and then there's a local area scale, right? So all these three scales, and within that you can have, so for example, the sectoral plans and stuff cannot be at a local scale. That will be either at a regional scale or a metro scale or a, so you need to obviously decide at which scale what goes in, and then also allow water governance kind of perspectives to operate independently of the planning sort of device. So it's not sort of 100% full integration, perfect utopian world I'm talking about. It is tackling certain things at various levels to address that problem, specifically. Not that everything can be, brought in together and create a perfect world. Yeah.
Well, there's quite an interesting thread there in the sense like, yes, there is a solid rationality to claim that master plan is local as an instrument. But given the fact that there are these demands that require, and whether it is risks or otherwise different kinds of dependencies of the cities and urban localities that require coordination across scales. Maybe one of the things that we need to start looking at is that reimagining that master plan instrument.
Yes.
Towards enabling it or strengthening it to coordinate across the scales.
Yeah.
And to accommodate various kinds of challenges that emerge from different scales for accommodating water governance. That itself could be one direction in which we could pursue this effort to reimagining the statutory master plan.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Yeah. No, I agree. I think the master plan device itself, as I've been saying, it's, I don't want to indicate it. It's, much of the world has moved beyond it, right? So, but obviously the idea is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So there are ways in which you can have a spatial planning, sort of system, but within a larger framework. That's the idea, that the spatial plan should not be dictating everything else. The larger socioeconomic plan and the larger environmental ideas should dictate the spatial sort of, device, right? So it should actually inform the other way around instead of just, and even, this, even just an aside, now there's a lot of critique around the master plan as a device, and suddenly we're going to form-based codes, right? There is this, within the government, they're like, okay, let's look at form-based codes. But that's again going one more step below. You're looking from planning, you're gone to design, which is at the one step below. You're not looking at the larger socioeconomic question, right? So I just feel that having that larger for example, the integrated development plan that I'm talking about in South Africa, that is looking at the larger socioeconomic, plan which integrates all of this, and then having a special plan which responds to that, right? So there are ways. I'm not saying that for all of these there are problems. So obviously, we are all living in a human world where there are multiple interests which will always clash against each other, and things will not work in the way it is meant to, right? But even then, if that, having said that, we still can have a framework which looks at master plan differently, which make the limits or reimagines its scope differently, and have the multi-scalar model where it adds up to the larger, and it's not too different from what we already have. We have the idea of a structure plan and a perspective plan and a master plan and a local area plan, even within our own devices, within URDPFI and all of that, right? It's just that that's not how it is actually translated. Maybe it's time to start trying to make some of those things happen.
Well, on that note, thank you, Matthew. I think we should close it. We are past the scheduled time by almost 20 minutes. So I mean, that's quite a bit to think about, and I think we look forward to your paper that you're working on and
Yeah,
keeping
yeah.
this.
No, I mean, last that I said 1 year back, I said, at that time I said I'm working on that paper and I've not done that. I've not finished it. So, so yeah, I just, I have this idea that I should do it, but, there are multiple other things that come in the way. So hopefully this one I will
Maybe
work.
when you come next for another talk, then by the time you would have that paper finished and then you circulate it.
Yeah.
Yes. So I hope that it will be sooner. And thank you all for joining there. And then we have quite a good number of people continuing to be around, even though it is past 5. So that shows it's quite an interesting talk. And then there's plenty to think about. And we do keep collecting those crumbs, and hopefully we will improve our own thinking around our research program. Thank you very much, Matthew. Just to let you guys know, all of you, those who are interested in this TED Talk series, I think there is one thing that is watch out for this space, at least the TED's alerts, where we do have an annual lecture that is coming up on the 16th of September, but that is not going to be online. But if you're going to be around in Delhi, that's going to happen at India International Center by Professor Asit Biswas. You will be seeing those alerts. With that, thank you again, Matthew.
Thanks, Srinivas. It was a great
we'll continue
opportunity.
these conversations.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.